The ledger had not been opened in 11 years. Thea Mallory knew this because the last entry, recorded in a precise, unhurried hand, was dated the 14th of March, 1887, and the ink had faded to the color of old tea. She set it carefully on the library table, smoothed the cover with the flat of her palm, and began to read. It was her third week at Dunmorrow Hall. Lord Ardwell had hired her through a solicitor in Edinburgh, a formal arrangement conducted entirely by letter to catalogue and assess the estate's archival records before a proposed sale of the northern parcels. The North Fields had been leased to tenant farmers for generations. The question, as the solicitor had framed it, was whether the existing lease agreements were in order before any transfer of title. Thea had assumed they were. She had assumed this would take 6 weeks, perhaps 8. She had assumed she would ride the train back to her flat in Toronto in autumn, file her report, and never think of Dunmorrow again. The ledger was the third she had examined. The first two had been unremarkable, routine entries, rents collected, repairs noted. This one was different. The discrepancy was so small she almost missed it. A lease renewal for the Greyfield farm, issued in 1882, recorded an annual rent of 14 shillings per acre. But the corresponding receipt book, which she had pulled the previous afternoon and left open on the side table, showed the tenants had been paying 22 shillings per acre since 1879. 3 years before the renewal was recorded, and 8 shillings more per acre than the ledger acknowledged. Thea did not move for a long moment. The library was cold and very quiet. Outside, rain moved across the moors in slow grey curtains, and the window glass ran with water. She pulled the receipt book closer, turned back to the ledger, checked the page numbers, the original sequence, the binding, the paper weight. She was not imagining it. She began making notes. The pattern, once she found it, was not subtle. It was only careful. Every 5 years, the estate ledger recorded a lease renewal, with rents set at one figure. The receipt books, the actual accounting of monies collected from the tenant families, told a different story. The Greyfield farm, the Dunmore cottages, the 3 small holdings along the western ridge. All of them paying more than the official record showed, and had been doing so for decades. The difference never appeared in the household accounts. It did not pass through the estate solicitor. It was simply not there. Someone had been collecting the surplus and keeping no record of where it went. Thea worked through the following week without speaking of it. She catalogued, she cross-referenced. She built, column by column, a table of every discrepancy she could find, dating back to 1861. The oldest entry she could confirm was a lease renewal for the Harrow Ridge parcels. A widow named Prue Tansworth, paying 11 shillings more per acre than the ledger recorded, for 31 consecutive years before her death. 31 years. Thea thought about that in the evenings, sitting at the small writing desk in her room. She thought about Prue Tansworth rising before dawn, in a stone house on a windy ridge, working through the short northern summers, sending her payments to the estate office in the belief that this was simply what land cost, not knowing, perhaps never suspecting, that her neighbour 2 farms over paid considerably less. It was not Thea's place to form opinions. She had been hired to assess the records and prepare a report. She reminded herself of this as she sharpened her pencil each morning and as she closed the ledgers each night. She reminded herself of it again on the morning she requested an interview with Lord Ardwell. The interview was granted 4 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, in the study that faced the west garden. Lord Ardwell was not what she had expected. She had pictured someone older, grey-haired, perhaps comfortable in his distance from the daily business of the estate. Ardwell was somewhere in his middle 30s, lean, and gave the impression of a man who was not often required to wait for anything. He stood at the window when she entered, and he did not sit. Miss Mallory. He said it the way one says a name one has not thought about since last reading it on a document. I understand you've completed your preliminary assessment. I've completed a portion of it, my lord. I came to discuss something I found before I went further. He turned from the window. His expression did not change. She set the folder on the desk between them, her table of discrepancies, with the corresponding ledger pages and receipt records noted beside each entry. She had organized it chronologically. She had checked every figure twice. She spoke for perhaps 8 minutes, walking him through the pattern, the farms affected, the approximate total in discrepancy over the period she had been able to confirm. She kept her voice even. She cited the documents by date and page number. When she finished, the study was very quiet. Lord Ardwell looked at the folder without touching it. Then he looked at her. You're suggesting my estate records contain fraudulent entries. I'm suggesting the records are inconsistent, my lord. I don't know the origin of the inconsistency. I thought you should see it before I continued. And what exactly is it you believe you've found? Thea paused. Tenants paying significantly more than the official rent for a very long period of time, with no record of where the difference went. He was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly, but a kind of careful containment. Miss Mallory. He picked up the folder, set it down again without opening it. I hired an archivist, not an auditor. The scope of your engagement is catalogue and assessment of the archival materials, not an investigation into estate financial practices. I understand that, my lord. This arose from the cataloguing. And you've taken it upon yourself to construct. He glanced at the folder. Tables. And comparisons. The documents required cross-referencing. This is what I found. He looked at her for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was not unkind exactly, but it had a quality of patient finality, as though he were explaining something to someone who had not quite understood. I appreciate your thoroughness. However, I'd ask that you limit your focus to the task you were engaged for. Estate financial matters are handled by my solicitor. If there's something to be addressed there, it will be addressed through the appropriate channels. He moved toward his desk, a small, clear gesture of dismissal. You're not without some ability, I'm sure, but an archivist with a few weeks of access to the records is not in a position to understand the full complexity of how an estate of this size operates. Thea looked at him. He did not look up from the papers he had drawn toward him. I find competent archivists every few months, he added quietly. I need someone who can complete the work they were hired for. Thea took a breath. She picked up the folder from the desk. She straightened the pages inside it, a small, automatic movement, and closed it. I see, she said, and she walked to the chair where she had left her coat. She did not hurry. That was the thing she would remember later. When she thought back to those minutes, she had no impulse to hurry. She put on her coat with the same deliberateness she brought to everything. Buttoning each button, smoothing the collar, she tucked the folder under her arm. She crossed the study to the door. Miss Mallory. She stopped. She did not turn around immediately. You would be leaving your position. Yes, she said. I would. A pause. Then, without completing the work, she turned then. Lord Ardwell was standing beside his desk, and there was something different in his expression now. Not quite the composed certainty he'd worn throughout the interview. Something had moved in it, briefly, like a fault line shifting. The work, Thea said, is what I've been doing. The records I examined are real. The discrepancies are real. The tenants affected are real. She kept her voice entirely level. You may find someone who will catalogue the archive and say nothing. That is your right. But I won't stay and finish a task on the condition that I pretend I haven't seen what I've seen. She turned back to the door. I'll send a written summary to your solicitor in Edinburgh. The documents he'll need are already organized. She did not wait for his response. She posted the letter to the Edinburgh solicitor the following morning from the village post office in the rain. The train back to the south did not leave until afternoon, and she sat in the small station waiting room with a cup of tea that went cold and her notebook open on her knee, though she wrote nothing in it. She thought she should feel something more definitive. Angry, perhaps, or satisfied. She felt neither, exactly. She felt the specific quiet of having done the thing she was going to do, and finding it was exactly as simple as she'd known it would be. A man came to sit across the platform, sheltering under the overhang, and nodded to her. She nodded back. The rain continued. A sheep somewhere on the adjacent hillside made a sound of great and weary complaint. Thea had grown up in a house where money had once been plentiful and then was not. Her father had been a solicitor himself, a careful and principled one, and when he died, he had left 3 daughters and a great many debts and a library of good books. She had learned to work early, and she had learned to work well, and she had long since stopped expecting that doing good work would always be received as such. These 2 things could coexist. A thing could be done properly and still be inconvenient to someone. That was not, ultimately, her problem. What she had done was her responsibility. What Lord Ardwell did with it was his. The train came at 2:20. She boarded it, found her seat, and watched Dunmorrow's hills fold away behind her in the grey light. The solicitor's name was Mr. Polhaven, and he wrote to her 6 weeks later at her flat in Toronto. The letter was formal, careful, and brief. He had reviewed the documents she had organized. He had, he wrote, brought certain matters to the attention of relevant parties and would be conducting a review of the estate's financial records going back to 1870. He thanked her for her thorough attention to the material. She read it twice over breakfast, then set it aside and poured more coffee. 3 weeks after that, a second letter arrived. This one was not from Mr. Polhaven. It had no letterhead. The handwriting was not what she had expected. Less the controlled penmanship of formal correspondence, and more the hand of someone writing quickly, pressing hard into the paper. Miss Mallory, I have been asked, and have refused, to write this letter several times, which is perhaps why it has taken me this long. I'm writing it now because not writing it has become a more uncomfortable position than writing it. The review is ongoing. What you found was accurate. I knew, not the full extent of it, but I knew the records were not in order, and I allowed the situation to remain, because examining it closely would have required confronting things I preferred not to confront. This is not a justification. I am stating it because the alternative is to let you believe I simply didn't understand what you showed me, and that would not be accurate. I was discourteous to you. I implied your work was beneath the complexity of the situation. Both of those things were untrue, and I knew it at the time. I don't expect a reply. I would not fault you for not sending one, but I wanted you to have the truth rather than the version I offered in the study. Ardwell Thea read the letter through once. She set it on the table. She looked at it for a moment, then she folded it back along its creases and put it in the small wooden box where she kept documents she intended to keep. She wrote back. Not that day. She thought about it for several days, walked to the water in the evenings, and thought about it there, sat with the question the way she sat with most things, without forcing it toward a resolution before it was ready. What she wrote, in the end, was not long. Lord Ardwell, thank you for writing. I imagine it was not easy to do. I want to say something plainly. What I hope for, in whatever follows from the review, is that the families affected are made whole, not in part, not with a settlement structured for the estate's convenience. In full, with interest, in a way that allows them to know what was taken from them, and that it has been returned. They deserve to know the truth, even if it is uncomfortable. If you are prepared to ensure that, then I have no remaining grievance. M. Mallory. She posted it on a Tuesday, walked home in the cold October air, and made soup for dinner. His next letter came 2 weeks later. Miss Mallory, what you described is what I intend. Not what I intend to try, what I intend. The Polehaven Review has confirmed figures going back to 1868. 3 families remain who have direct descendants living in the area. I have written to each of them. The others will be addressed through an independent trust. I will not have my solicitor manage it. I've engaged an outside firm. I am telling you this not because I require your approval, but because you asked for it, and you asked honestly, and I find I am unexpected interested in giving you an honest answer. You were right. About the records, and about everything else you said in the study, I was not in any meaningful sense of the word correct. Lord Ardwell. For the first time, Thea smiled at one of his letters. She noticed, also, that he had signed it differently, not Ardwell, the name as a title, held at arm's length, the way he'd said her name on the first afternoon, but Lord Ardwell, full and unguarded, the way a person signs their name when they're no longer trying to maintain a particular impression. She noticed it and did not say anything about it, not in that letter. They continued to write through November and into December. The letters changed gradually, in the way that correspondence changes when 2 people stop performing carefulness and begin simply speaking. He wrote about the review, and then about the estate, and then about the strange experience of having a thing he'd avoided for years, suddenly made plain and irreversible. She wrote about her work, about a commission in Montreal she was considering, about the particular pleasure of archival work in the way it required following a thread through a room full of noise until it led somewhere true. He wrote back about threads and noise and rooms full of competing claims on attention, and she thought, reading it, that he was not writing only about document management. In January, she received a letter asking whether she would ever find herself in Scotland again. She thought about it for 3 days. She wrote back, possibly. In the spring, if the Montreal Commission concluded as planned. His reply came than any previous letter. If you do come north in the spring, I would ask that you permit me to call on you, not in my capacity as your former employer, simply as, I confess I'm not certain what the appropriate word is, someone who would like the opportunity to apologize in person and who is, in addition, unexpectedly interested in continuing the conversation. I will understand if you decline. Castan, just the first name, this time, no surname, no title. Thea looked at it for a long time. Outside her window, Toronto was buried in February, the streets cold and white, and the ice on the lake was an unbroken grey-blue sheet running to the horizon. She had lived in this flat for 4 years, and she knew every sound it made in winter. She was, she realized, not unhappy. She was also, she realized, holding a letter that required answering. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her, Castan. In the spring, then, she posted it the same afternoon, walking through the February cold, her breath making brief clouds in the air. And she found that she was thinking, not nervously, but with a settled, particular clarity, about the specific shade of a Scottish sky in April, and what it might look like from the window of a house she had once walked out of, and whether there was something fitting, or simply something honest, in the idea of walking back in.